Well, folks, it's gotta be hard. It's gotta be really tough to deal with when you think you have a winning position against the great Magnus Carlsen. You think the game is in the bag, you're about to defeat the world's #1 player, and then all of a sudden, within the space of only a few moves, to your utter horror, you realize that not only are you not going to win, but you can't even draw the game, and the full point is going to Carlsen. This is any serious chess player's worst nightmare, and it's one that became a reality for the world's #2 player, Fabiano Caruana, in this recent game from the semifinals of the Champions Chess Tour, which we're about to take a look at right now. Carlsen with the white pieces begins the game with e4, and we go right into a Ruy Lopez with a lot of book moves, a lot of theory. That's what I like to see. We got d4 from Carlsen, getting his ideal pawn center, hitting the bishop, which drops back to b6, bishop to e3, and then we have a lot of moves here which are fairly predictable for this opening, nothing too crazy. We have the bishop going to c2. Caruana is expanding on the queen side. The bishop reroutes to d3, targeting b5. Bishop to d7 indirectly defends that pawn. If you were to try to capture it, then knight takes d4 would win the pawn back, because if you try to do something like bishop takes d7, well, knight takes f3 comes with check. So white is not winning a pawn there. So what Carlsen does is increases the pressure on b5 instead with the move queen to e2. We have a pawn trade on d4, and then knight to e7. And again, the b5 pawn is adequately defended. If you were to take, then there'd be bishop takes, queen takes, and then bishop takes d4 with a discovered attack on the queen. White is not winning a pawn. So instead, Carlsen plays rook a to c1. We got knight to g6, clearing the half-open file for the rook, which is placed opposite Carlsen's queen, so he gets out of the way with queen to f1, wants to avoid any future tactics. And now bishop to a5, pinning the knight to the rook. Carlsen gets out of the pin with rook e to d1. Now we got c6, b5 is well defended. e5, now striking in the center. The knight goes to d5, bishop takes g6, and after f takes g6. Carlsen does not grab the pawn on d6, since doing so would open the file. There'd be two pieces hitting the bishop. Caruana would get his pawn back. So instead, there's knight to e4, increasing the pressure on d6, and now rook to f8, setting up a tactic, letting the d6 pawn go, because Caruana now has bishop takes h3, and of course after g takes h3, there's no longer any protection for the knight. The rook captures on f3. So things are starting to get interesting. Carlsen's king is a bit exposed. He plays queen to g2, hitting the rook, and now we have the first significant mistake of the game. What would you play in this position? Well, the correct move, which Caruana did not find, is to take with the rook. And after f takes e3, you're going to get the exchange back with knight takes e3, forking. White plays queen takes g6, knight takes d1, rook takes d1, and now black needs to play queen to g5 check, forcing the exchange of queens. And in this position, the material is even, and white has a slight edge. This knight is very good, but black does have the bishop. And with correct play, he will probably survive. But Caruana played the inferior knight takes e3 in this position, which gives Carlsen a big opportunity, which he misses. He plays queen takes f3. Very natural looking, but it's not the best move. The game proceeds knight takes d1, rook takes d1. But let's look at what he should have played. F takes e3. This is the winning move, so what's the difference here? Well, now if you want the pawn on e3, you got to take it with the rook. Rook takes e3. And after queen takes g6, knight to f5 is a very serious threat. It's going to come with an attack on the rook. Mate is going to be threatened on g7, as well as knight takes h6 check since this pawn is pinned. And if you try to get white's queen off the board, like in the other variation, with queen to g5 check, well, here we have queen takes, h takes g5, knight f5 comes with tempo on the rook, you gotta move, and then knight to e7 check is going to pick up the c6 pawn. While hitting the rook and the bishop, after rook a8 to defend the bishop, you can take like this, and this is just a totally winning position for white. With the two connected pass pawns, black is not going to survive this. So that was Carlsen's first big opportunity. But he played queen takes f3. We had knight takes d1, the rook takes, and then bishop to c7. Caruana does not like this knight on d6, and he's willing to give up a pawn on c6 in order to get rid of it. Queen takes c6 by Carlsen, but after bishop takes d6, Carlsen throws in this check, the king moves, and then he captures with the pawn. He's now a pawn up, but these are doubled and they're weak, and he's not going to remain a pawn up for very long. There's queen d7 now, hitting h3, the king defends, and now rook to b6. You can't save this d6 pawn. So what's played is queen to e4, the rook takes the pawn, and now d5. Pushing his passed pawn, although it's not going to go any further anytime soon. Rook to f6, we got rook d3, and now the rook goes back to d6. Are we going to see a repetition? No, Carlsen does not want that. He plays queen to e5. And according to the engine, the position is dead drawn. But Caruana is going to have to be very careful to keep this passed pawn under control. Queen d8 is what's played. King f1 now from Carlsen. Where do you think this king is going? Well, it's going to go on a bit of a journey, as you'll see. Queen to c7 from Caruana. Rook to c3 hits the queen, goes back to d7, hitting d5 with two pieces again, so the rook goes back to d3 to defend. Queen to d8, I guess it's just sort of a waiting move. King to e2. Now queen to b6, eyeing f2. Queen to d4 offers a queen trade, which Caruana declines. It's probably a good idea. King to d2. And if you haven't guessed already, this king is looking to get all the way over here to the a2 square, which is going to be the safest place it can be. Queen to f7 is played next. We got king to c2, and now rook to f6, targeting f2 with two pieces. Carlsen pushes the pawn to f3, but Caruana does not take the bait. He does not take the pawn on f3, because if he did with rook takes f3, then the rooks would come off the board, queen takes f3, and here comes the d pawn. The queen can throw in this check and then get in front of the pawn, and we have a position that may still be objectively drawn, but it does look very scary. Black is better off keeping the queen and the rook on the board, which is why he plays queen to c7 check here. The king goes to b1, and now queen to d6. Again, blockading. We got king to a2. After a long journey across the board, the king has finally reached its safe haven. We got rook to f4, hitting the queen on d4, queen to e3, b4, threatening to come to b3 with check, which would drive the king to the back rank, and then there would be the constant threat of a back rank mate. Carlsen obviously doesn't want that, which is why he takes the pawn on b4. The rook takes, and now we got queen to d2, eyeing the rook, forming a queen and rook battery behind his pawn, looking very nice. Rook goes to b8, and now we have rook to d4, targeting the a4 pawn. Rook to b3 now, with a counterattack on f3. Rook to d3 blocks that. Rook goes back to b8, rook to d4, hitting a4 again. Now we have rook to b5, hitting the pawn with two pieces, so you're not going to want to take on a4. And we have a couple moves that don't do a whole lot, just kind of waiting moves here. Queen to d3, attacking the rook, and at this point things start to get interesting. Caruana plays rook to b3, hitting the queen, also eyeing f3. So naturally, Carlsen drops the queen back to d1 to defend the pawn, and now queen to b6. b2 is now hit by two pieces, and what Carlsen really needs to play here is rook to d2, defending. But for some reason, he opts for this blunder, queen to d2, which just drops the pawn on f3. Did he just forget about it? I don't know. Maybe he was planning d6 here, not realizing that in this position, black has queen to b3 check, driving the king to the back rank, after which rook to f1 check will end in mate. So Carlsen did not fall for that, and at this point played rook to d3. He realized now that he has to stop the queen from coming into b3, so the rook goes to f2, attacking his queen, which is not the strongest move. Rook to f1, according to the engine, was a little bit stronger because it comes with the looming threat of eventually getting a piece to a1, which will be checkmate. But rook to f2 is still winning. The queen goes to c3, defending b2, and now we have queen to d6, getting in front of the passed pawn. That's a good move. Queen to c6 from Carlsen, hoping that Caruana will take his queen, and after the pawn recaptures, white would actually be winning in that position, but Caruana is not going to fall for that. He goes queen to h2, hitting b2 with 2 pieces again, and hitting h4. b2 needs to be defended, which is why Carlsen plays queen to b6, and now the pawn's captured on h4. Of course, Carlsen does have rook to d4 in this position, hitting the queen, and now queen g3 is played, and he can grab a pawn at a4, but he doesn't do it. He realizes that it's more important to play queen to b4, supporting the advance of his passed pawn further, covering the a3 square, the importance of which is demonstrated by Caruana's next move, a3. Queen takes a3, and the most decisive move at this point for Caruana would just be to take the queen with check, the king takes, and then just get the pawns going over here on the king side. If Carlsen were to play d6, rook to f8 is in time to stop that pawn. And these passed pawns will prove decisive. Black has a winning position. But for whatever reason, Caruana didn't go for that. He played queen to e5 instead, which is still winning. It's attacking the rook. Queen to d3 defends. Now queen to d6, getting in front of the pawn. He's trying to play it safe. We got rook to a4 from Carlsen, looking to get to a6, defended by the queen to dislodge Caruana's queen. Rook f5, hitting the pawn with 2 pieces again, so it needs to be defended. Rook to d4. And now we get rook to f8, maybe looking to come over here with a check. b4 is played. Carlsen getting his second passed pawn going. He knows that advancing these pawns are his best chance for survival. The rook comes into f2 with check. King to b3, and now queen to f6. Threatens rook to f3, which would win the queen, pinning her to the king. Queen gets out of the way. Now rook to f3 check. Rook goes in the way, and now rook to f2. Caruana now has the idea of bringing the queen into b2 with check. Looks pretty scary. But Carlsen says, you know what? I don't see a checkmate there. I'm just going to push my pawn. He plays d6. And while it's true that queen to b2, the move Caruana played next, does not force mate, there is a better move that he missed that would be absolutely devastating, and that move would have been queen to a1. Now there's a lot of variations that you have to look at in order to understand why this is the best move. I'm just going to show you a few of them. First of all, let's look at the obvious d7. If you just try to advance the pawn, this runs into a forced checkmate beginning with queen to a2, king c3, and then queen to b2. That is checkmate. So you got to give your king some breathing room. So let's just look at one other line. If you were to move the queen from c4 to give your king a square, let's say you play queen to b5, then there's queen to a2 check, king goes to c3, and we drive the king towards the center of the board with this move here, rook to f4 check, drives the king up the board, and then you're going to play rook to f5 check and win the queen. In all these lines, the white king either gets checkmated or white is going to lose the queen in some way, which is why this is the winning line for black. But Caruana did not see this. He played queen to b2 check, which actually completely throws away the win. After Carlsen's king to a4, the position is now drawn. His king is not in any real danger, and these 2 passed pawns are dangerous enough to secure him the draw. We got queen to a1 check from Caruana. The king goes to b5. Queen going to a8, looking to harass the white king from this side of the board now. And as scary as this looks for white, black has nothing, because after rook to f5 check, incredibly, white can draw the game by sacrificing his queen. The best move here, and the only move that draws, is queen to c5. And I'll show you the key drawing line real quick. If the rook takes, then the pawn takes. The queen has to go in front of the d-pawn, and then we play c6. Black can try to get these pawns moving, but there's going to be c7. Queen's got to take, white's going to queen the pawn, queen's got to take, rook takes, and this is drawn. According to the engine, the rook will be sufficient against these 3 pawns. But this is not what was played. Instead of queen to c5, Carlsen said, I don't want to lose my queen. I'm going to play king to b6, which gives Caruana a forced mate, beginning with queen to b8 check. This is the correct move. King goes to a6, and here rook to f6 is the quickest, but Caruana plays queen to a8 check first, king to b6, now rook to f6 check. This is not the most efficient, but it is still winning. Carlsen plays king to c5, allowing Caruana to win his queen, with rook to c6 check. King goes to d4, rook takes, king takes. Carlsen's hoping that his passed pawns with his active king and rook are going to save him. But Caruana is still winning. He plays correctly, he blocks the pawn with the queen, and this is looking similar to the variation we looked at previously, except that the pawn is on the b file instead of the c file, and Carlsen's king is further away from the action. So black is still winning here. Carlsen plays b5, but again, Caruana throws away the win with the move queen to c7 check. Now why is this a bad move? Well, because after the king moves, you just got to put your queen right back where she came from, right? Because this pawn has to be stopped. And you've just wasted 2 moves with your queen. The correct way to proceed here was g5. And I'll briefly show you the way black wins. White will advance the pawn to b6, and then these pawns will start moving over here on the king side. b7, queen to c7 check is the key move. Now, wherever this king moves, to either file, one of these 2 pawns is going to be able to be captured with check. So let's say king b4, then queen takes b7 check, king goes to c5, queen c7 check, and then we just proceed with g3. Letting white queen the pawn, you take, rook takes, g2. Rook has to go back to d1 to stop the pawn, but now here comes the other pawn, h4, rook to g1, h3. This rook is no match for these 2 pawns. And what's going to happen after something like a king move? What else can white do? We got h2, rook takes, and then there's your queen. So that's how black could have won. But Caruana, instead of playing the winning g5, threw it away with queen c7 check, king to b3. Of course, the queen has to go back in front of the pawn so it doesn't queen. And now it's Carlsen's turn to blunder. He throws away the draw by playing king to a4. What he needed to play was king to c2. Why? Because he needs to be able to advance this pawn, and he cannot let Caruana take either one of these pawns with check. And having the king on c2 is going to accomplish that. And I'll show you a variation in a minute that demonstrates this. Okay, b6 is what Carlsen played, and the key line to demonstrate why the king is misplaced on a4 begins with the move g5, which is not what Caruana played, but it goes b7, g4, and then white would like to play rook to c3 here. This is the idea. You want to get the rook to c8, and black is not going to be able to prevent a pawn from queening. But the problem here is that the move queen takes d7 comes with check. If the king was on c2, this wouldn't be the case. You take that pawn, then this pawn is just free to queen. That's why the king should not be on a4. But what was played in the game here was not g5, it was this move h3. Why did Caruana play this? Perhaps he missed that rook takes h3, Carlsen's next move, comes with check. If that did not come with check, then that pawn could not be captured, as queen takes d7 check would win the rook. That's the only explanation I can come up with. Now his king has to go to g8, the rook goes back to d3 to defend the pawn on d7, and the game is again drawn. But it's not going to stay that way. King to f7 played by Caruana. Here comes the other pawn, b7. The king goes to e7, and here comes Carlsen's king. Caruana now starts pushing the g-pawn with g5. He wants to force Carlsen to take that pawn with his rook at some point, after which he can grab the pawn on d7. King c6 played by Carlsen. Here comes g4. And now rook to e3 check. And here's a little quiz position for you. What should Caruana play in this position? Well, the correct move, which he did not play, was king to f7. The point is, after rook to e8, you got queen to f6 with check, which is going to be perpetual. Anywhere the white king goes, there's going to be a check, and the game will end in a draw. But what was played instead of king to f7 by the great Caruana, the world's number 2, was king to f6. And after Carlsen played rook to e8, we have a resignation. Because the king is blocking your queen, there are no checks. An incredible oversight by Caruana and a true nightmare. Having worked so hard to get a winning position, only to throw it away on move 84, giving Carlsen the draw, and then throwing that away on move 90, handing him the full point. So I hope you enjoyed this. There was a lot of mistakes in this game by both players, but as they say, it's not about who makes the first blunder or even the most blunders. It's about who makes the last blunder. So thanks for watching. Please subscribe if you enjoyed this content, and I will see you on the next video.